Hey party people, I'm Pastor Lia Scholl from First Friends Meeting in Greensboro, North Carolina. The title of this sermon is, I Felt It Shelter to Speak to You, which comes from a line in a letter written by Emily Dickinson. It made me start wondering how to be shelter through my very words. So be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Very early in this pandemic, I read a book called Disaster Spiritual Care, which explained that in a disaster, the first thing you do is get someone out of the path of the storm. Then you triage their needs, shelter, food, water. And that's when the spiritual caregiving begins. The book said the role of the spiritual care provider is to help those affected draw upon their own emotional and spiritual resources in the midst of their pain. The goal of the work is not to take away their grief, but to help them through their grief, through presence, prayer, and appropriate ritual. The problem is that in a pandemic, there's no getting out of the path of the storm. There's no place where the danger is not. And triaging needs is difficult, we find, because of supply lines, systemic injustices like a lack of affordable housing and health care, and the seemingly endless ways that the fractures in our nation's politic and policies create distrust, with misinformation and demonization on the other side. Add to that the very idea that we can have our own emotional and spiritual resources is contrary to what a lot of religion has taught us. What we've been taught is that in order to survive spiritually, we have to show up every week at the meeting house or the church. We must listen to the sermon and follow the directions that the spiritual leaders, so-called spiritual leaders, are telling us to do. What happens when we can't show up? Let's face it, Zoom is better than nothing, but just barely. It's not shelter, it's not shade, and it's not justice. Our text this morning is from Isaiah chapter 15, and it's an admonition to Bat Zion, daughter of Zion, to provide shade, shelter, and justice to Moabite women. Like last week's passage, today's is again full of feminine verb endings, which reiterate the idea that this is addressed to a feminine entity. The text basically works on two levels. Bat Zion could be Judah, the daughter of God, the state, and daughter of God. Or it could be an individual daughter of Judah, the daughter of the city. So let's hear how Dr. Wilda Gaffney translates verses 3 and 4. Receive counsel, daughter, grant justice. Make your shade like night at the midpoint of noon, daughter. Daughter, shelter the outcasts, the fugitive, do not expose. Let them settle among you, daughter, the outcasts of Moab. Be a shelter to them from the destroyer. Isaiah is calling the daughters of Judah to grant justice, shelter, and shade to the supposed enemies of Judah, the daughters of Moab. Judah's relationship with this border country was always tumultuous, and foreign women in the Hebrew scriptures, as Dr. Gaffney puts it, are treated as prospective danger, irresistible to Israelite men through their sexual wiles, leaving Israelite men straying from their God. But Isaiah tells the women of Judah to provide them shelter. What do we know about the women of Moab and their destroyer? Not much. But I'm reminded of a line from one of Warson Shire's poems. No one leaves home unless home is in the mouth of a shark. Make your shade like night at the midpoint of noon. Shelter the outcasts, the fugitives. Do not expose, but let them settle among you. So God, through the prophet Isaiah, implores the women of Judah and Judah herself to care for those who are experiencing a disaster. But what do we do when we're all experiencing the disaster? How do we deal with all of the losses we have collectively experienced? How do we face the grief we are all experiencing and will continue to experience together? Because it's not just the pandemic. It is the rise in violence in our cities. It is the loss of control of our own lives. It is economic uncertainty. It is the loss of rituals. It is the loss of friendships. It is the loss of normalcy. Add to that the normal losses of every day, the way folks disappoint us, the way people leave our lives, and I might add our meetings and our churches. It's too much. Catherine Schultz at the New York Times wrote it this way this week. I have a ghost calendar for the last 2 years. An eerie anti-diary of a kind you surely have as well. It records what didn't happen. A family Thanksgiving, never before missed. A concert, postponed and rescheduled and then finally canceled. Some work travels. A wedding I was meant to attend in May 2020, and then August 2020, and then June 2021. For 2 years now, the future as we envisioned it has been steadily fading away in front of us. And we're feeling a deep collective grief. There is so much to grieve right now. In her book, The Language of Emotions, Carla McLaren calls grief the deep river of the soul. She says, grief asks us to become quiet and stop all forward movement so that we may dive deep into the depths. But she cautions, the intellect doesn't know how to go deep, not like the emotions can. The intellect usually tries to lift us out of the water and dry us off before we've really immersed ourselves in grief. She says we trick ourselves into thinking we can guard ourselves against all pain if we just refuse to grieve. But that refusal can be a deadly mistake. In refusing, we move farther and farther away from ourselves, and then we fail to connect deeply with the people in our lives, and we lose connection to the real flow of life, and we dry up inside. So what do? In grief, we must stop, drop everything, and ask 2 internal questions. What must be mourned? What must be released completely? This process can be done in community, which is, of course, hard right now. But y'all, 20 plus years of pastoral ministry has taught me that if we face this grief in this moment, we will save our future selves from an even deeper pain. How can we practice this? McLaren suggests that we can return to a practice of grief over and over again until we feel settled. And this is how she recommends doing it. First, she says you ground and center yourself. I know you all know how to do this. This is where you breathe and you get quiet, where you open yourself to the silence. Then she recommends creating a shrine, a container for your grief. If you're grieving a death, maybe it's gathering photos and personal items and reminders of your lost love. If your grief relates to the death of a relationship, a goal, an idea, your health, your trust, or something that you've never had, your shrine can contain any items that symbolize your loss. There should be also something disposable in your shrine too, so that you can ritualize the end of your mourning as clearly as you ritualize its beginning and its unfolding. Sometimes when you move into that space of grief, it will feel like grief is pushing down on you. Try to remember that that's what grief does. The movement of grief is downward. And that feeling can help you feel the weight and the depth of your loss. Then, when you feel that pressing down, ask yourself, what needs to be mourned and what needs to be released completely? There will be tears. Cry them all. The funny thing about grief, y'all, is that we deny it in order to hold on to the people or the things that we have lost. But doing this grief work allows us to invite those things and those people and their spirits back into our lives. It is as if we're trying to hold on to them, but not grieving is the very thing that cuts us off from them. And grieving opens the pathway back up. I have found this to be true in my own life. So I wonder, what losses do you feel most deeply right now? And will you stop, drop everything, and ask those questions? What needs to be mourned? What must be released completely? This pandemic has taken so much from all of us. What you are feeling is real. You don't have to go it alone. You can invite a friend or a loved one into your grief with you, or call me. I'm willing to walk alongside you. If we do this grief work, we will be better prepared for the future. It's not magic. It's still going to hurt. And it will get better with time. Amen? Amen.